Before memory, before mortal thought could reach backward through the mists of creation, the multiverse existed in a state of formless potential. The void held no shape, no definition, no boundary between what was and what might be. Within that emptiness, two forces stirred. They did not wake from slumber, for they had never slept. They did not emerge from hiding, for there was nowhere to hide. They simply were, and in being, they became aware of one another. The gods, beings of purpose and design, looked upon the raw chaos and saw possibility. The primordials, beings of elemental fury and untamed essence, looked upon the same void and saw freedom. Neither understood the other, neither could accept what the other desired. The cosmos itself hung in balance between these two visions, and the tension between them would ignite the longest and most devastating conflict the multiverse would ever witness. The first gods did not arrive through birth, as mortals understood it. They manifested as expressions of fundamental concepts drawn forth from the raw substance of possibility itself. Moradin took form as the embodiment of creation through craft. His will focused on permanence and structure. Corellan Larethian emerged as grace and beauty given consciousness, a being of infinite creativity and fluid perfection. Pelor blazed into existence as light itself made divine, carrying warmth and life wherever his presence touched. Erethis shaped herself from the patterns of civilization not yet built, holding within her essence every law and every city that would ever stand. Each god carried within themselves a portfolio, a domain of existence that they would claim and define through their actions. They looked upon the formless void and felt a profound need to give it structure, to transform chaos into cosmos, to build something that would endure. The primordials rose from different origins entirely. They were not expressions of concepts, but manifestations of raw elemental force. Piranoth, the world shaper, commanded earth and stone on scales that dwarfed continents that did not yet exist. Nehushta, the fire mother, burned with flames that preceded the sun, her heat born from the friction of reality grinding against itself. Bryakus, the howling storm, embodied wind and rage, his form shifting between states of matter without pause or pattern. Cryonax, later called the Prince of Frost, gathered cold around himself like armor, drawing warmth from everything his presence touched. These beings did not seek to create in the manner of the gods. They sought to express, to unleash, to transform everything they encountered into extensions of their own elemental nature. Where the gods saw potential gardens, the primordials saw potential wildfires. Where the gods imagined ordered cosmos, the primordials celebrated eternal flux. The first attempts at creation began without conflict. The gods worked together, their combined will pressing against the formless void, giving it dimension and substance. They shaped the astral sea, a realm of thought and dream where distance became meaningless and time flowed according to will rather than law. They carved out dominions within this new space, creating the earliest divine realms where their power could rest and gather strength. Moradin forged the first mountains from nothing, proving that permanence could exist where before only change had reigned. Erethis laid down the first patterns that would later become natural law, establishing cycles and repetitions that gave the cosmos rhythm. The gods discovered that by working in harmony, their individual powers multiplied, creating results none could achieve alone. The euphoria of successful creation drove them forward, and they began to dream of ever greater works. The primordials noticed these efforts with growing unease. They had not opposed the early shaping because they did not recognize it as opposition to their nature. When the gods carved the astral sea from the void, the primordials saw it as merely another expression of change, no different from their own constant transformations. But as the divine works grew more permanent, more structured, more resistant to elemental force, the primordials began to understand what was happening. The gods were not simply creating, they were constraining. Every law they established reduced the freedom of elemental chaos. Every permanent structure they raised limited the space where pure change could occur. The primordials gathered in the spaces between nascent planes, their essences mingling in ways that would have destroyed lesser beings. They did not speak, for they had no language. They did not plan, for they acknowledged no future. But they shared their rage, and in that sharing they found terrible purpose. Io, the ninefold dragon, held unique status among the earliest gods. His nature encompassed all draconic potential, every color and metallic hue, every alignment from righteousness to corruption. Where other gods claimed specific portfolios, Io claimed possibility itself as it related to his children. He did not join the early councils of creation, preferring to work alone, shaping forms that would later become the first dragons. His solitude granted him perspective the other gods lacked. He saw both the necessity of structure and the value of chaos. He understood that absolute order would eventually stagnate, while absolute chaos would prevent anything meaningful from ever emerging. This understanding placed him in a position no other god occupied, able to see all sides of the growing conflict. His later actions during the war would reflect this unique comprehension, though the cost of his wisdom would prove catastrophic. The first true confrontation occurred in a place that had no name, because names had not yet been fully established as concepts. The gods had gathered to create what would become the elemental planes, intending to contain and organize the raw forces of fire, water, earth, and air into distinct realms. They envisioned these planes as foundational layers beneath the material world they hoped to eventually craft. The primordials arrived as the work began, their presence announced by reality itself shuddering around them. Piranoth drove his essence into the forming earth plane, attempting to shatter it back into undifferentiated stone. Nehushta poured her flames across the nascent fire plane, seeking to transform organized conflagration back into pure burning chaos. The gods found themselves suddenly engaged not in creation but in defense, struggling to maintain the integrity of their work while beings of equal power sought to unmake it. This first battle lasted for what might have been moments or millennia. Time had not yet been fully defined, and within the space where gods and primordials clashed, causality itself bent and fractured. Moradin stood before Piranoth, matching his strength against the earth primordial's raw power, discovering for the first time that his divine might could be resisted by elemental force. Corellon danced between attacks from multiple primordials, his grace allowing him to evade destruction but not to strike decisive blows against beings who could reform themselves from their own scattered essence. Pelor blazed with light intense enough to burn away shadows that had existed since before existence, yet the primordials did not require light to see, and his radiance wounded them no more than darkness would. The battle ended without victor or vanquished. The gods maintained their hold on the elemental planes they had begun to shape, but they could not force the primordials to retreat. The primordials demonstrated they could disrupt divine work, but they could not completely unmake what the gods had established. Both sides withdrew, and in that withdrawal, both sides understood that this conflict had only begun. The gods retreated to their dominions in the astral sea and held council. For the first time, they spoke of war not as abstract possibility but as immediate necessity. Erethys argued that the primordials represented fundamental opposition to everything the gods sought to build. She claimed that no compromise existed between eternal change and lasting structure, that the conflict could end only when one side or the other ceased to resist. Moradin supported her assessment, though he spoke with sorrow rather than anger. He had felt the satisfaction of creation, the joy of making something that would endure beyond his own attention, and he could not surrender that joy for any peace. Corellon urged caution, suggesting that perhaps some accommodation might be reached, some division of the cosmos that would allow both forces to coexist. Pelor listened to all arguments and finally spoke with the weight of the sun behind his words. He declared that if the primordials would not allow the gods to create freely, then the primordials had chosen war through their opposition. The gods began to prepare. The primordials gathered in the spaces between forming planes, in the cracks and voids where reality had not yet fully solidified. They brought with them servants and creations of their own. Elemental beings, raw and terrible, emerged from their essences. Titans, shaped from living stone and bound lightning, appeared in numbers beyond counting. The primordials did not organize these forces into armies as the gods would later do. They simply directed them toward divine holdings and let elemental nature guide their actions. Bryakus unleashed storms that tore through the astral sea, shredding portions of divine dominions and scattering the substance of those realms across empty void. Cryonax froze entire sections of nascent plains, transforming places the gods had warmed with life potential into dead expanses where nothing would ever grow. The primordials discovered that destruction came easier than creation. What took the gods extended effort to build could be unmade in moments of concentrated elemental fury. The gods responded by creating their own servants. Angels manifested as extensions of divine will, beings of pure purpose, shaped to carry out specific tasks within the growing conflict. The first angels were not the organized hierarchies that would later emerge. They were improvised weapons, divine power given barely enough form to direct it toward enemies. Some angels burned with Pelor's light, their touch searing primordial essence. Others carried Moradin's strength, their blows capable of shattering even Titan armor. Still others moved with Corellan's grace, darting through elemental defenses to strike at vulnerable cores. The gods learned warfare through practice, adapting their divine natures to the demands of prolonged conflict. They discovered that immortality did not mean invincibility. Divine essence could be wounded, diminished, even temporarily dispersed by sufficient primordial assault. This knowledge changed them. Fear entered the divine consciousness for the first time, and with fear came innovation born of necessity. Battles erupted across every nascent realm. The elemental chaos, that portion of the cosmos the primordials claimed as their domain, became a launching point for assault after assault against divine holdings. The gods fortified their positions, learning to weave protective wards from their combined powers. They established strongholds in the astral sea, great floating fortresses where wounded angels could retreat and divine strength could gather for counterattacks. The primordials adapted in turn, their elemental servants growing more focused, more purposeful in their destruction. What had begun as random expressions of chaotic nature became directed campaigns of unmaking. Neither side gained lasting advantage. Territory changed hands repeatedly as first one side then the other concentrated overwhelming force at specific points. The cosmos itself suffered from this continuous conflict. Regions of space began to show scars that would never fully heal, places where the boundary between reality and void had been weakened by repeated divine and elemental assault. Thurisdan entered the war as an enigma among gods. His portfolio touched upon aspects that other deities avoided, concerned with entropy, ultimate endings, and the space beyond even divine understanding. He had participated in the early councils of creation, though he rarely spoke, his presence a dark counterpoint to the enthusiasm of his fellow gods. As the war intensified, Thurisdan began to advocate for a solution that other gods found disturbing. He suggested that perhaps the conflict itself was the problem, that existence balanced between creation and destruction might be inherently unstable. He proposed that true victory required not defeating the primordials, but transcending the entire paradigm that made conflict inevitable. The other gods listened but did not understand. Erethys dismissed his words as defeatist. Pelor argued that creation justified any struggle. Corellan alone showed interest, engaging Thurisdan in long discussions about the nature of reality itself. These conversations would later prove significant beyond what any god could have foreseen. The creation of the Abyss marked a turning point in the war's conduct. The gods, seeking a weapon that could match primordial destructive capacity, attempted to forge a realm that embodied chaos as completely as the primordials themselves, but directed that chaos toward divine purposes. Multiple accounts exist regarding which gods participated in this work. Some chronicles claim Thurisdan led the effort, channeling his understanding of entropy into the project. Others suggest Corellan and Moradin attempted the creation together, seeking to contain elemental chaos within divine structure. What all accounts agree upon is the result. The abyss came into being not as a weapon but as a wound, a hole in reality that could not be closed or controlled. The newly formed realm began consuming everything nearby, drawing in elemental substance and divine essence alike, transforming all it touched into something neither fully chaotic nor fully ordered but wholly malevolent. The gods attempted to seal their creation, to lock it away where it could harm neither side, but the abyss resisted all efforts at containment. The abyss produced its own denizens almost immediately. Demons, beings of pure malice and destruction, emerged from the realm's depths in overwhelming numbers. These creatures served neither God nor primordial. They existed only to destroy, to consume, to spread the emptiness of the abyss across all reality. Both gods and primordials found themselves fighting a two-front war, defending their holdings not only from each other but from demonic incursions that recognized no alliance and accepted no surrender. The primordial Bryakus fell to a demonic horde while attempting to destroy a divine stronghold in the forming plane of air. His essence was dragged into the abyss, transformed into something unrecognizable, a fate that horrified both sides of the conflict. The demons proved that annihilation was possible even for beings of elemental and divine nature. Death, true death, had entered the cosmos. Io attempted to broker peace during this period of three-way conflict. The ninefold dragon arranged a convocation in a neutral space, a pocket realm he carved from the astral sea and fortified against interference from any party. Representatives from the gods and primordials attended, though many came armed and warded, trusting nothing. Io spoke of mutual destruction, of the damage inflicted upon the very fabric of existence by the continuing war. He demonstrated that entire regions of nascent reality had been rendered permanently uninhabitable by the violence, that the cosmos they all fought over was being destroyed by the fighting itself. He proposed division, suggesting that gods could claim certain realms, while primordials held others. With agreed boundaries neither would cross. For a moment, peace seemed possible. Then Nehushta, her rage undiminished by millennia of war, rejected all compromise and attacked those assembled, declaring that primordials would bow to no agreement that limited their freedom. The convocation dissolved into another battle, and Io's hopes for peace died in flames that consumed his carefully prepared neutral ground. The gods began to understand that victory required not merely defeating the primordials in battle, but changing the fundamental rules under which the conflict operated. Erethys proposed the creation of laws that would govern reality itself, principles so fundamental that even primordials would have to operate within their constraints. Moradin supported this idea but questioned whether gods possessed the power to establish such universal rules. The answer came from an unexpected source. Au, who had observed the conflict from some realm beyond even divine perception, manifested for the first time. His presence dwarfed that of any god or primordial. He spoke only briefly, establishing himself as the over-god, the being who would set the ultimate laws governing all others. He declared that gods would have their ordered creation, but they would operate under restrictions that would prevent them from again creating disasters like the abyss. Primordials would be defeated, but not destroyed, contained rather than eliminated. The war would end, but it would end according to terms he established, not through simple victory by either side. The gods found themselves empowered and constrained simultaneously by Au's intervention. They gained access to power they had not possessed before, divine might channeled through the laws Au established. They discovered they could now create with a permanence that primordial force could not easily unmake. But they also discovered limits placed upon their actions, boundaries they could not cross, regardless of their will or power. Some gods celebrated this development, seeing in Au's laws the structure they had always sought to impose upon reality. Others, Corellon among them, chafed at the restrictions, missing the freedom they had known before Ao's manifestation. Tharizdun responded most strongly of all, declaring that Au had merely replaced primordial tyranny with divine tyranny, that true freedom had been lost for all beings. His increasingly erratic behavior during this period concerned the other gods. but they remained focused on the war and paid insufficient attention to his growing madness. The primordials reeled from Ao's intervention. They discovered that their elemental essence, once unlimited in its expression, now operated under constraints they could not identify or resist. Piranoth attempted to shatter a divine stronghold that had previously been vulnerable to his attacks and found his power simply stopped at the fortress walls. Unable to penetrate wards that drew their strength from Ao's fundamental laws. Cryonax unleashed cold that had previously frozen entire plains and watched it dissipate against divine defenses that should not have been able to resist absolute elemental force. The primordials understood they had lost something essential, though they could not name exactly what had changed. Rage filled them. Rage directed no longer just at the gods but at existence itself for betraying their elemental nature. This rage made them more dangerous even as it made them more vulnerable, causing them to attack without consideration for their own survival. The great Titan foundries began operation during this phase of the war. The primordials, recognizing that they were losing ground despite their fury, created massive worldlets where they could forge weapons and servants on unprecedented scales. These foundries floated in the elemental chaos, drawing power from the raw substances around them. Within their depths, primordials shaped titans of increasing size and power. Some stood as tall as mountains that would later be raised on the material worlds. Others commanded elements with such precision that they could unmake divine works from a distance, requiring no direct contact. The primordials sent these titan armies against divine positions in waves, accepting massive casualties in exchange for any tactical advantage. The gods responded by creating their own manufacturing sites, divine forges where angels were shaped in vast numbers, where weapons of terrible power were imbued with multiple divine essences to maximize their effectiveness against elemental targets. The battle for the nascent plane of water demonstrated the new scale of conflict. Nehushta led a primordial assault that included thousands of fire titans, intending to boil away the entire ocean plane and transform it into steam that would disperse across the cosmos. The gods gathered their strongest water-aligned forces, including Melora in her earliest form and several minor deities whose portfolios touched upon seas and rivers. The battle lasted through what might have been centuries if time had been flowing normally. Entire regions of the waterplane were indeed boiled away, creating vast voids where steam condensed and fell as rain that had nowhere to land. Fire titans sank into abyssal trenches, their flames extinguished by pressure that crushed even their elemental forms. Nehushta herself dueled with Melora and 3 other gods simultaneously, her flames bright enough to illuminate the entire plane. The battle ended inconclusively, with the waterplane scarred but intact, and Nehushta wounded for the first time in the war. She retreated into the elemental chaos, where she would remain for ages, gathering strength for future campaigns. Moradin established his primary hold during this era, carving out a realm that would later be known as his divine domain. He shaped mountains from the Soshan, substance of the astral sea, creating peaks that towered over anything the material worlds would later contain. Within these mountains, he built the first true forges, places where divine crafting could occur with security from primordial assault. Moradin labored at these forges personally, creating weapons for the other gods, crafting armor for angels who would otherwise be vulnerable to elemental assault. His hammering rang through the astral sea, a steady rhythm that contrasted with the chaos of battle occurring in all directions around his domain. Primordials assaulted his mountains repeatedly, recognizing that destroying the forges would cripple divine military capacity. Every assault failed. Moradin defended his works with ferocity that surprised even his fellow gods, his strength seemingly unlimited when protecting what he had built. Dozens of primordials and thousands of titans fell attempting to breach his defenses. The mountains of his domain became littered with the wreckage of their failed attacks. Corellan's approach to the war differed markedly from Moradin's defensive crafting. The elven god moved constantly through the contested territories, appearing wherever divine forces struggled, turning battles through personal intervention rather than through construction of lasting defenses. His sword, forged in Moradin's early works, could cut through Titan armor as though it were mist. His presence inspired angels to impossible feats, his grace showing them patterns of movement they could not have conceived alone. Yet Corellon also suffered more wounds than any other god, taking terrible damage in battles where he stood alone against overwhelming elemental force. Other gods questioned his tactics, suggesting he conserve his strength rather than spending it so freely in defense of minor positions. Corellon rejected such advice, arguing that every position mattered, that each small victory prevented primordial momentum from building to unstoppable levels. His willingness to place himself in maximum danger earned him loyalty from angels and minor deities that would prove crucial in later phases of the war. The creation of the Far Realm occurred during a period when Tharizdun had grown increasingly isolated from the other gods. He had ceased attending councils, no longer contributed to the war effort, spent his time exploring the boundaries of existence itself. When asked about his activities, he spoke of discovering truths the other gods were too blind to see, of finding powers that predated even primordials and gods. The other deities dismissed his claims as madness brought on by war stress, a condition they were beginning to recognize even in divine consciousness. They did not realize that Tharizdun had indeed discovered something, a realm beyond the boundaries Ao had established, a place where reality operated under completely alien principles. The Far Realm predated the cosmos the gods and primordials fought over, and it harbored entities that viewed both sides of the conflict as intruders into a larger multiverse. Tharizdun's contact with these alien entities transformed him, filling him with visions of a cosmos cleansed of both divine order and elemental chaos, returned to some primordial state that preceded all current existence. Tharizdun's betrayal began subtly. He started providing information to primordials, revealing divine troop movements and stronghold locations through intermediaries that could not be traced back to him. Several divine defeats that should not have occurred suddenly made sense when viewed as results of compromised intelligence. The gods suspected traitors within their ranks but focused their suspicions on minor deities and powerful angels, never imagining that one of the original gods could turn against their cause. The primordials welcomed the information without questioning its source, using it to strike divine positions with unprecedented accuracy. They achieved victories that reversed divine advances of centuries, reclaiming territory they had lost and threatening strongholds previously considered impregnable. Only when Tharizdun appeared personally at a divine fortress and opened its gates to primordial assault did the truth become undeniable. The Chained God, as he would later be known, had chosen neither the divine cause nor the primordial but some third option that required the destruction of both. The gods' response to Tharizdun's betrayal was immediate and overwhelming. They could not allow a divine-level being to operate openly in support of their enemies. Pelor, Erethys, Moradin, Corellon, and dozens of other deities hunted Tharizdun across the plains, pursuing him through the elemental chaos and into regions of nascent reality where existence itself remained unstable. Tharizdun fought with powers none of them recognized, wielding energies that seemed to corrode divinity itself on contact. He wounded multiple gods severely before they managed to corner him in a void between forming planes. The battle that followed became known in later ages as the Binding, though that name understated the violence involved. Tharizdun demonstrated the ability to call upon entities from the Far Realm, bringing alien horrors into reality to fight alongside him. The gods countered by channeling their combined essence into bonds of pure divine law, chains forged from the fundamental principles Ao had established. After combat that left several gods permanently scarred, they succeeded in binding Tharizdun, imprisoning him in a specially created demiplane where his corruption could not spread. They could not destroy him, for the laws governing divine existence prevented permanent annihilation of one of their own, but they could ensure he never again acted freely in the cosmos. The primordials learned of Tharizdun's fate and understood that the gods had grown strong enough to defeat and imprison even one of their own. This knowledge shifted primordial strategy. They began to fight more carefully, preserving their forces rather than expending them in overwhelming assaults. They established defensive positions in the elemental chaos, creating regions so hostile that even gods would struggle to attack them. The war settled into a new phase, one characterized by strategic positioning rather than constant assault, by raids and counter-raids rather than massive battles. Both sides used this period to recover from the losses they had sustained, to rebuild armies, to forge new weapons. The pause in large-scale combat allowed both sides to assess the true cost of the conflict. Entire sections of reality that should have been vibrant with life potential had been rendered forever barren. Realms that gods had dreamed of creating would never exist because the space they would have occupied had been too damaged to support any form of permanent existence. The primordials saw their elemental chaos diminished, its infinite potential reduced by divine containment and structure. Io made a second attempt at peace, though he approached it differently than his first effort. Rather than calling a formal convocation, he visited primordials individually, speaking with each about the possibility of ending the conflict through mutual recognition rather than total victory. Some primordials listened. Piranoth, grown weary from millennia of warfare, expressed willingness to accept boundaries if they were established through negotiation rather than force. Others rejected any peace. Cryonax among them, declaring that they would fight until either the gods were destroyed or the primordials themselves ceased to exist. Io brought these mixed results to the Divine Council, arguing that partial peace was better than continued total war. He suggested that gods could negotiate with those primordials willing to accept boundaries while continuing to fight those who refused compromise. The Divine Council debated his proposal extensively. Erithis argued against any negotiation, insisting that accepting primordial surrender was the only acceptable end to the war. Moradin suggested that perhaps Io's approach had merit, that they should explore whether some primordials might be turned from the conflict. The debate continued without resolution until events made the discussion irrelevant. The primordial alliance fractured from within. Tensions that had always existed between different elemental types exploded into open conflict when Nehushta emerged from her long recovery and immediately attacked positions held by Bryakus's successor, claiming that air primordials had grown too willing to accept divine terms. Water primordials joined the assault on air holdings, seeing an opportunity to expand their influence within the elemental chaos. Earth primordials fortified their positions, refusing to support either side in what they viewed as an unnecessary internal conflict. The gods watched this development with cautious hope, recognizing that a divided primordial force would be far easier to defeat than the unified opposition they had faced for so long. Some gods argued for immediately exploiting the primordial disunity, launching major assaults while their enemies fought amongst themselves. Corellon counseled patience, suggesting that allowing the primordials to weaken each other would serve divine interests better than intervention that might reunify them against a common threat. The primordials' internal conflict lasted generations by any measure that could be applied. Entire regions of the elemental chaos were reshaped by battles between fire and water, between earth and air, between different interpretations of elemental nature itself. The Titan foundries produced weapons used not against gods but against fellow primordials. Some primordials sought divine aid, offering alliance in exchange for support against their elemental rivals. The gods found themselves in the strange position of being courted by beings who had been their mortal enemies since the war's beginning. The Divine Council debated each offer carefully, accepting some and rejecting others based on complex calculations of advantage and risk. They formed temporary alliances with specific primordials, providing military support in exchange for promises of future non-aggression. These alliances rarely lasted long, dissolving as soon as the immediate threat that prompted them had been resolved, but they demonstrated that the absolute polarization of the early war had broken down into something far more complex and potentially manipulable. Io's death came without warning, and under circumstances that would be debated for the remainder of existence. The ninefold dragon had traveled into the deep elemental chaos, allegedly seeking another primordial who might be convinced to abandon the conflict. He encountered something, though accounts differed on whether it was a primordial ambush, an assassin sent by those opposed to peace, or something else entirely from beyond conventional reality. What remained undisputed was the result. Io's divine essence was sundered, split into two separate beings who would later be known as Bahamut and Tiamat. The Platinum Dragon and the Chromatic Queen emerged from their progenitor's destruction already in conflict with each other, embodying different aspects of Io's nature pushed to extremes that could not coexist. The other gods discovered Io's fate when both Bahamut and Tiamat appeared at divine councils, each claiming to represent Io's true legacy, each demanding the other be recognized as a corruption that should be destroyed. The gods refused to choose between them, granting both seats on councils and equal status in divine hierarchies, but the message was clear. Even gods could die, could be transformed into something unrecognizable. The war had claimed its most powerful victim. The gods initiated their final campaign against the primordials shortly after Io's destruction. They had grown strong enough, organized enough, and sufficiently skilled in warfare to believe they could achieve total victory. They launched simultaneous assaults against every major primordial holding in the elemental chaos, committing their full military capacity to overwhelming campaigns that accepted no possibility of retreat or failure. Angels died in numbers that would seem impossible if tallied. Divine strongholds were abandoned, their garrisons reassigned to offensive operations. The primordials, still divided among themselves, found themselves unable to mount coordinated defenses. Earth primordials fell to divine armies, supported by air-aligned primordials seeking advantage against their elemental rivals. Fire primordials were extinguished by combined divine and water primordial forces that temporarily set aside their mutual hatred. The elemental chaos became a charnel ground where the debris of destroyed titans formed mountains and where primordial essence flowed like rivers of molten stone. Pyranoth made his stand in a worldlet he had shaped at the beginning of time, a place of such geological perfection that even gods acknowledged its beauty. He gathered around him the remaining earth primordials and those titans who still answered his call. The divine army that assaulted his position included Moradin personally, the dwarf god leading his angels in siege warfare that would establish the pattern for all future divine conflicts. The battle for Pyranoth's worldlet lasted longer than many entire wars between lesser beings. Moradin and Pyranoth dueled repeatedly, their personal combats shaping the terrain around them through the mere force of their conflict. Mountains rose where Moradin's hammer struck. Canyons opened where Pyranoth's power tore the worldlet's surface. Eventually, inevitably, Moradin's superior position told. He had the full support of the other gods, reinforcements that arrived in waves, supplies that never ran short. Pyranoth fought alone, his allies fallen, his titans destroyed. The end came when Moradin's hammer shattered Pyranoth's core, dispersing the primordial's essence across the elemental chaos. The worldlet itself crumbled, its perfect geology collapsing without the primordial power that had maintained it. Nehushta refused to accept defeat, even as the war turned irrevocably against the primordials. She gathered the remaining fire-aligned primordials and launched a final assault not against divine military positions, but against the astral sea itself. She intended to boil away the foundation of divine power, to transform the realm of thought and dream into superheated vapor that would offer gods no place to stand. Her assault breached the outer boundaries of the astral sea, and for a brief period it seemed she might succeed. Flames spread through regions that had never known heat, consuming divine constructs that had stood since the war's beginning. Pelor met her at the heart of her, Advance, the sun god facing the fire primordial in combat that illuminated every plane of existence. Their battle transcended simple violence, becoming a contest between two different interpretations of what fire meant, what light could be. Pelor's light carried warmth that nurtured life. Nehushta's fire consumed everything it touched, recognizing no boundary between fuel and ash. The sun god prevailed, though he bore scars from the encounter that would never fully heal. Nehushta's essence was bound rather than destroyed, imprisoned in a specially created prison plane where her flames could burn for eternity without threatening the wider cosmos. The remaining primordials scattered into the deepest reaches of the elemental chaos, abandoning any attempt at continued organized resistance. The gods pursued them relentlessly, hunting down primordials individually, binding or destroying them according to Ao's laws. Some primordials accepted imprisonment without resistance, worn down by ages of warfare, and willing to accept any end to the fighting. Others fled beyond the boundaries of the established cosmos, entering regions so remote that even gods hesitated to follow. Cryonax established his domain in the quasi-plane of ice, a realm bordering the elemental planes but not fully part of them, where his power remained strong enough to deter divine pursuit. A handful of minor primordials survived by pledging service to the gods, accepting positions of servitude in exchange for their continued existence. These survivors would spend the ages that followed bound by divine restrictions, their elemental nature constrained by laws they had no power to resist. The war ended not with a final battle but with gradual recognition that no primordial remained capable of meaningful resistance. The gods declared victory and began the work of building the cosmos they had fought so long to create. They shaped the material plane, establishing the world that would eventually be known as Tauril. Along with countless other worlds across the vast expanse of physical reality, they codified the laws of nature, establishing principles that would govern how life emerged and evolved. They created the weave of magic, that fundamental structure through which mortal spellcasters would eventually channel arcane power. Every aspect of their creation bore the marks of lessons learned during the Dawn War. They built redundancy into their systems, ensuring that no single failure could unmake everything. They established boundaries and separations between realms, preventing conflicts from spreading across the entire cosmos. They created hierarchies among themselves, recognizing that some level of structure even among gods helped prevent the kind of internal conflicts that had so weakened the primordials. The costs of victory became apparent as the gods surveyed what they had built and what they had lost. Entire categories of divine being that had existed at the war's beginning were now extinct, their essences dispersed beyond any possibility of recovery. The far realm remained accessible, its alien inhabitants now aware of the cosmos the gods had created and potentially interested in expanding into it. The abyss continued to grow, its endless layers spawning demons that would threaten mortal and divine alike for all ages to come. Thurisdan remained imprisoned but not destroyed, his cult already beginning to form among mortals who sensed his power even through the barriers of his binding. The scars in reality, where the fighting had been most intense, would never heal, becoming places of wild magic and planar instability that would cause problems for ages to come. The gods had won their war and gained their ordered cosmos, but they had paid prices they were only beginning to understand. The primordials who survived in imprisonment or exile did not cease to matter to the cosmos. Their elemental essence remained part of the fundamental structure of reality. The elemental planes continued to embody primordial nature even under divine law. Warlocks would eventually learn to draw pacts with imprisoned primordials, channeling their power through the barriers of divine constraint. Cults dedicated to primordial release would form among mortals who resented divine authority or who believed that elemental freedom represented a higher truth than ordered civilization. The gods established watchful guards over every primordial prison, assigning angels and loyal divine servants to ensure that none of the great elemental beings ever escaped to resume the war. These guards would maintain their vigils faithfully, but they could not prevent primordial influence from seeping slowly into the material plane through the very structure of elemental reality. Moradin's role in the post-war order extended beyond simple crafting. He became the architect of divine civilization, the god who designed the systems through which deities would interact with mortals and with each other. He established the concept of divine portfolios as formal grants of authority, creating structures that would prevent destructive conflicts among gods similar to the internal warfare that had weakened the primordials. He forged artifacts of such power that they could channel divine essence safely, allowing gods to act in the material plane without risking direct confrontation with each other. His hammers continued to ring through the divine realms, now crafting tools of peace rather than weapons of war. Other gods sought his counsel when establishing their own domains, recognizing that his experience during the war had taught him principles of construction that transcended simple physical crafting. Corellon adapted to the post-war era with less ease than Moradin. The elven god had thrived during the conflict, his nature suited to constant action and immediate crisis. Peace left him restless, uncomfortable with the slow work of building civilization and establishing lasting institutions. He created the elven people as expressions of his own nature, beings who would carry his love of beauty and artistry into the material plane while retaining the grace that had served him so well during the war. His relationship with Moradin cooled somewhat, the differences in their temperaments becoming more pronounced without external threats to unite them. Nevertheless, mutual respect survived their growing distance. Corellon acknowledged that Moradin's structured approach had been essential to victory, while Moradin recognized that without Corellon's willingness to take terrible risks, the war might have been lost during its darkest periods. Pelor assumed leadership of the Divine Council in the post-war era, though his authority came from respect rather than formal power. He had borne his wounds from battling Nehushta without complaint, had continued to provide light and warmth even when weakened by conflict. The other gods looked to him for guidance when disputes arose, trusting that his judgment would balance justice with mercy. He devoted his attention to ensuring that the mortal races would have the resources they needed to thrive in the cosmos the gods had created. Sunlight, warmth, the cycle of days, all flowed from his domain into the material plane. He established temples and priesthoods, creating structures through which mortals could channel divine power in support of their communities. His faithful would become among the most numerous in all the worlds, drawn to the uncomplicated goodness he represented. Erithis turned her attention to mortal civilization with intensity that bordered on obsession. She had argued throughout the war that structure and order justified any cost, and she intended to prove that thesis through the societies she would help mortals build. She granted inspiration to leaders and lawmakers, whispered guidance to those who drafted the first legal codes, blessed the construction of cities and governments. Her vision of proper civilization was rigid, perhaps excessively so, but it provided frameworks within which mortal societies could stabilize and grow. She came into conflict with gods who emphasized individual freedom over collective order, particularly those deities who drew their power from nature and wilderness. These conflicts never escalated to warfare, the memory of the Dawn War too fresh for gods to willingly enter into open conflict with each other, but tensions remained beneath the surface of divine cooperation. The dragons emerged as the most significant legacy of Io's pre-death activities. Both metallic and chromatic dragons carried within them aspects of the ninefold dragon's nature, his understanding of the balance between creation and destruction, order and chaos. Bahamut became the patron of the metallic dragons, emphasizing justice, protection, and the use of power in service of good. Tiamat claimed the chromatic dragons, teaching them that power justified itself, that strength gave license to rule, that lesser beings existed to serve draconic majesty. The two deities remained in permanent opposition, their conflict playing out through their dragon children across countless worlds. Neither could acknowledge the other as legitimate, yet neither could unmake the other, for both carried equal claims to Io's legacy. Their eternal struggle became a microcosm of the Dawn War itself. Creation and destruction locked in permanent tension. The mortal races that emerged during the early post-war period bore marks of their origins in a cosmos recently torn by divine conflict. Dwarves carried Moradin's love of crafting and permanence, their souls shaped by exposure to his divine essence during their creation. Elves embodied Corellon's grace and longevity, their culture emphasizing art and beauty in ways that reflected their creators' values. Humans appeared without clear divine parentage, their origins mysterious even to gods, their nature more flexible and adaptable than races more clearly shaped by specific deities. Dragonborn descended from the servants of Io, carrying draconic might in humanoid form. Tieflings bore the taint of contact with the abyss, their lineages scarred by exposure to the realm the gods had accidentally created. Each race inherited something of the conflict that had shaped the cosmos, whether through direct divine involvement in their creation or through the ambient divine and primordial energies that saturated reality. The establishment of the divine domains within the astral sea followed patterns learned during the war. Each god created a realm that reflected their nature but also provided strategic depth and defensive capacity. These domains became homes to angels and divine servants, manufacturing centers for holy artifacts, gathering points for faithful souls who would serve their gods even after mortal death. The gods established protocols for interaction between domains, creating divine law that prevented the kind of destructive internal conflicts that had weakened the primordials. They agreed that disputes would be resolved through negotiation or through limited proxy conflicts in the material plane rather than through direct divine warfare. These agreements held imperfectly, violations occurred and would continue to occur, but they prevented any return to the total war that had characterized the Dawn War. The elemental planes remained touched by primordial nature despite divine victory. Gods could impose structure on these realms, but could not entirely remove their fundamental character. The plane of fire remained a place of heat and burning, where flame lived as a force unto itself regardless of divine intention. The plane of water held oceans without bottom, storms without end, currents that flowed according to their own nature rather than any externally imposed order. Earth and air, metal and wood, ice and magma, all the elemental variants remained more primordial than divine, places where the ancient conflict's outcome remained ambiguous. Mortal planeswalkers who ventured into these realms encountered environments that predated divine victory, where elemental nature still held sway and where primordial essence could be felt in every substance and energy. The Shadowfell and Feywild emerged as echo planes of the material world, realms shaped by divine action but reflecting different aspects of reality. The Feywild embodied the exuberance of creation, the pure joy that gods had felt when they first began shaping the cosmos. Its inhabitants lived in eternal twilight between day and night, experiencing beauty and wonder without the harsh necessities that governed material existence. The Shadowfell reflected the costs of the Dawn War, the darkness and sorrow that had accompanied divine victory. Its inhabitants existed in diminished form, their essences drained of vibrancy, their lives touched by the grief that gods had felt upon recognizing what they had destroyed to achieve their ordered cosmos. Both planes served purposes within the divine order, the Feywild offering rest and inspiration, the Shadowfell providing necessary darkness and a place for souls to travel between death and afterlife judgment. Magic itself carried the war's legacy. The weave that gods established to govern arcane power bore scars from the conflict. Places where battles had been particularly intense became dead magic zones, regions where the weave had been so damaged it could not form. Other locations became wild magic zones, where spellcasting produced unpredictable results, the weave remaining unstable despite divine attempts at repair. The most powerful spells, those capable of reshaping reality, drew upon energies that dated to the Dawn War itself, channeling forces that gods and primordials had wielded during their most desperate conflicts. Mortal arcanists who learned these spells touched power that predated mortal existence, risking consequences that reflected the war's catastrophic nature. The creator races that would later shape material history had their origins in this immediate post-war period. Dragons claimed that title through their descent from Io, arguing that they represented the pinnacle of mortal development. Giants countered that they carried primordial essence within their bloodlines, that their strength came not from gods but from the elemental forces that had existed before divine order. These competing claims would fuel conflicts that lasted millennia, with dragons and giants engaging in wars that echoed the larger conflict between gods and primordials. Other races claimed creator status through different arguments. Saruk pointed to their ancient empires and their dominion over reptilian life. Batraki claimed primacy through their mastery of transformation magic. Aeri flew above all other races and claimed the sky itself as proof of their superiority. Each creator race believed itself destined to rule. Each carried within its culture memories or legends of the Dawn War that shaped their understanding of cosmic order. The gods established the planes of alignment following the war's conclusion, creating realms where moral and ethical principles took physical form. Mount Celestia rose as a monument to lawful goodness, its 7 heavens each representing a higher refinement of righteous behavior. The 9 hells descended into depths of lawful evil, each layer more perfectly corrupt than the one above. The abyss continued its chaotic evil expansion. Beyond divine control but contained by barriers the gods constantly reinforced. Elysium, Arborea, the Beastlands. All the upper planes came into existence as expressions of divine virtue. Hades, Gehenna, Carcery, the lower planes formed as necessary shadows, places where evil could be contained rather than allowed to spread freely through the material plane. This cosmological structure reflected lessons learned during the war. The gods had discovered that absolute elimination of opposing forces was impossible. Instead, they chose containment and balance, creating a cosmos where good and evil, law and chaos would struggle eternally, but where neither could achieve total victory. The material plane itself became the crucial battleground for post-war divine competition. Gods could not fight directly without risking another cosmic war, but they could compete through their mortal followers. Temples rose in every city, priests of different faiths arguing theology in marketplaces and councils. Divine magic flowed through faithful clerics, performing miracles that validated theological claims. Gods granted visions to prophets, sent angels to support righteous crusades, cursed those who defied their will. The mortal experience became saturated with divine presence, yet mortals retained free will, the ability to choose which god, if any, they would serve. This balance between divine influence and mortal agency represented another lesson from the Dawn War. Gods had learned that servants forced into service lacked the creativity and adaptability of those who chose their allegiance freely. Tharisdun's prison remained a source of divine concern despite the wards and barriers surrounding it. His cult grew in the shadows of mortal civilization, drawing adherents who resented divine authority or who had been touched by far realm influences that drove them toward madness. The gods assigned specialized orders of angels to monitor these cults, to eliminate them when they grew too powerful or too close to discovering methods of weakening Tharisdun's bonds. Occasionally, a cult succeeded in performing rituals that briefly channeled the chained god's power, causing localized catastrophes that required divine intervention to contain. These incidents served as reminders that the war's consequences remained present, that the victory gods had achieved was incomplete and required constant vigilance to maintain. The primordial cults that formed in opposition to divine order drew their members from different sources than Tharisdun's followers. They included elemental traditionalists who believed that primordial nature represented a purer form of existence than divine order. They included druids and primal spellcasters who drew their power from elemental sources and felt kinship with imprisoned primordials. They included rebels and revolutionaries who opposed all authority and saw in primordial freedom an alternative to both divine tyranny and mortal hierarchy. These cults rarely posed serious threats to divine order, lacking the organization and resources to mount effective campaigns, but they represented a permanent undercurrent of opposition that could never be fully eliminated. The passage of ages gradually transformed the Dawn War from immediate memory to distant legend. Mortals who had lived during the immediate post-war period died, and their descendants knew the conflict only through stories and theological teachings. The physical scars remained, visible to those who knew where to look, but their origins became matters of speculation rather than certain knowledge. Gods themselves began to view the war as ancient history, its lessons still relevant, but its immediacy faded. New gods ascended from mortal ranks, deities who had never known the existential terror of facing primordial wrath or the exhilaration of creation unbound by precedent. These younger gods learned about the Dawn War from their elders, but second-hand knowledge lacked the visceral impact of lived experience. Yet the war's influence never truly faded. The cosmology it established remained intact. The division between planes, the structure of divine domains, the containment of primordial forces. Every spell cast through the weave drew upon systems established during or immediately after the conflict. Every prayer answered by divine power relied on portfolios and authorities defined by war's necessities. Every find of planar boundary respected or transgressed reflected decisions made when gods and primordials clashed across nascent reality. The Dawn War did not simply precede the current cosmos. It defined that cosmos, shaped every aspect of existence that mortals and immortals alike took for granted. The greatest legacy of the Dawn War manifested in the fundamental stability of reality itself. Before the war, existence remained fluid, subject to change through simple application of sufficient elemental force. After the war, reality possessed resilience. Worlds could be damaged but not easily destroyed, planes could be invaded but not readily unmade, magic could be twisted but followed underlying laws that prevented complete chaos. This stability came at the cost of flexibility. The cosmos gained permanence, but lost the infinite potential that had characterized its earliest existence. Gods accepted this trade willingly, having fought too long for creation to risk its loss for the sake of abstract potential. Primordials in their prisons and exile mourned what had been lost, but their grief changed nothing. The age of fluid reality had ended, replaced by an age of structure that would persist through all ages to follow. The material plane hosted cycles of rise and fall, empires building and collapsing, mortal races ascending to dominance only to be replaced by others, yet these cycles occurred within bounds established during the Dawn War. No mortal catastrophe could match the devastation of divine primordial conflict. No mortal empire could threaten the fundamental structure of reality. The gods ensured this through their vigilance, preventing any accumulation of mortal power that might challenge cosmic order. Occasionally, mortals approached such thresholds. Netheril at its height, the Imaskari Empire during its dominance, several draconic empires that spanned continents, all tested the limits of what gods would tolerate. Each time, divine intervention ensured that mortal power remained bounded, that no repetition of the Dawn War occurred through mortal agency. The spell plague that would later ravage Toril demonstrated that even divine victory in the Dawn War had not eliminated all threats to reality's stability. When Sirik and Shah murdered Mistra and disrupted the weave, consequences rippled across the cosmos in ways that echoed the Dawn War's worst moments. Entire regions of the material plane were transformed or destroyed, planar boundaries weakened, magic became unreliable or completely unavailable in vast territories. Gods watched in horror as their carefully constructed order suffered damage they had believed impossible in the post-war era. The crisis ended, the weave was eventually restored through Mistra's resurrection, but the spell plague proved that the stability gods had fought for remained vulnerable to disruption by sufficiently powerful forces. The sundering that followed the spell plague represented divine acknowledgement that the cosmos, established after the Dawn War, had accumulated too many compromises and distortions. Gods worked together to partially reset reality, restoring elements of pre-spell plague existence while retaining beneficial changes. This vast work of divine cooperation recalled the unity gods had shown during the Dawn War's final campaigns. They set aside their conflicts and competing interests to repair fundamental damage, demonstrating that the lessons of their ancient struggle remained relevant. The sundering succeeded in stabilizing reality once more, but it required immense divine effort and left gods weakened for centuries afterward. The experience reminded all deities that their victory over the primordials had granted them dominion over reality, but not immunity from its complexities. Modern worship of gods across the D&D multiverse reflects layers of interpretation built upon the foundation the Dawn War established. Every temple's architecture embodies principles proven during Stepple's divine primordial conflict. Every theological argument about divine nature and mortal purpose draws upon revelations the gods achieved through their struggle against elemental chaos. Clerics who channel divine power through their faith utilize systems refined during the war's duration and codified during its aftermath. Paladins who swear oaths to divine ideals pledge themselves to values the gods learned to articulate while fighting for the right to shape existence according to those values. The entire edifice of organized religion, with its hierarchies and rituals and theological frameworks, rests upon the cosmic order the Dawn War made possible. The Abyss continued to expand through ages following the war's end, demonstrating that some consequences of divine action remained permanently beyond divine control. Demons spawned within its depths in numbers that exceeded angelic populations despite constant warfare between the two. The blood war that raged between demons and devils in the lower planes consumed both sides' resources while preventing either from threatening the broader cosmos, a fortunate outcome the gods had not planned but gratefully exploited. Occasionally, demons or devils broke free of their mutual conflict to threaten material worlds, requiring divine intervention to repel. These incidents served as reminders that the gods' creation remained imperfect, scarred by mistakes made during the desperate circumstances of the Dawn War. The Far Realm posed a different category of threat, representing forces that existed outside the cosmic order the Dawn War had established. Alien entities occasionally probed the boundaries of reality, seeking entrance or attempting to impose their own incomprehensible principles upon the cosmos. Gods maintained constant watch against such incursions, recognizing that Tharizdun's fall had resulted from Far Realm contact. Warlocks who formed pacts with Far Realm entities gained powers that operated outside normal magical law, drawing upon energies that bypassed the weave entirely. The gods could not prevent such pacts without violating principles of mortal free will they had established, so they instead worked to minimize Far Realm influence through other means, supporting orders of defenders who specialized in containing alien corruption. Primordial influence persisted through channels the gods could not completely control. Elemental warlocks drew power from imprisoned primordials through pacts that technically violated no divine law. Druids who embraced primal magic tapped into elemental forces that predated divine order, their spellcasting bypassing the weave entirely. Genasi carried primordial essence within their bloodlines, their elemental natures expressing themselves regardless of divine preferences. The gods tolerated these expressions of primordial nature because eliminating them would require oppression on scales that contradicted their own stated principles. This tolerance represented growth from the absolutist position gods had held during the war, recognition that total victory meant not eliminating all trace of primordial influence, but rather containing it within acceptable bounds. The gods themselves changed over the ages following the Dawn War. They developed individual personalities more distinct than their original natures, shaped by experiences with mortal worshippers and by endless small conflicts with rival deities. Some gods fell, their power diminished until they ceased to exist as independent beings. Others ascended, mortals achieving apotheosis through extraordinary service or cosmic circumstance. The divine population became far more numerous than the small group that had fought the Dawn War, with hundreds of gods claiming various portfolios across different worlds and pantheons. Yet all these younger gods operated within the framework the original deities established, following rules and occupying roles defined by the ancient conflict with primordials. Mortal magic users occasionally achieved powers that approached divine might, becoming archmages or epic spellcasters capable of reshaping reality on significant scales. The gods watched such individuals carefully, ready to intervene if mortal ambition threatened cosmic stability. Sometimes intervention took the form of divine sponsorship, gods offering ascension to apotheosis in exchange for loyalty. Other times, intervention manifested as divine opposition, gods working to ensure that a mortal's schemes failed before they could cause damage comparable to the Dawn War's devastation. This careful balance between allowing mortal achievement and preventing mortal excess became one of the most delicate aspects of divine oversight in the post-war cosmos. The dragon-giant conflicts that erupted periodically throughout history served as echoes of the Dawn War, with dragons claiming divine legacy through Io, while giants asserted primordial heritage through their elemental natures. These conflicts never approached the scale of the original war, but they devastated mortal civilizations caught between the two great races. Gods generally refused to intervene directly in dragon-giant wars, viewing them as working out of cosmic tensions that the Dawn War had created but not fully resolved. This non-intervention policy frustrated mortal populations suffering from collateral damage, but gods maintained that direct involvement would risk escalating regional conflicts into cosmic crises. The duration and consequences of the Dawn War remained subjects of scholarly debate among mortals, with different sages proposing wildly different chronologies and casualty estimates. Some claimed the war lasted mere centuries, while others suggested millions of years, the confusion arising from time's fluidity during the conflict itself. Estimates of primordial casualties ranged from dozens to thousands, depending on whether one counted only major primordials or included all elemental beings of significant power. Divine losses were similarly unclear, with some sources suggesting several gods died permanently during the conflict, while others claimed no permanent divine deaths occurred until much later. This scholarly uncertainty reflected the war's mythic status, an event so ancient and so cosmic in scope that precise details had been lost or transformed through countless retellings. The prison planes established to contain defeated primordials required constant divine maintenance, their wards and barriers slowly eroding under pressure from the elemental beings they confined. Gods assigned rotating duties to maintain these prisons, ensuring no primordial could exploit momentary inattention to escape. Occasionally maintenance failed, usually through sabotage by primordial cults, resulting in brief escapes that caused regional catastrophes before the primordials could be rebound. Each such incident prompted divine councils to review prison security, leading to ever more elaborate and redundant binding systems. The gods understood that they could never relax their vigilance, that the primordials they had defeated remained fundamentally opposed to divine order and would exploit any opportunity to resume the conflict. The mortal perception of gods changed as the Dawn War receded into mythic past. Early post-war generations worshipped deities with terror and awe, recognizing them as beings who had literally created the cosmos. Later generations approached gods with more familiarity, viewing them as powerful patrons and protectors, but not as distant cosmic forces. This shift troubled some gods who preferred worshippers to maintain appropriate reverence, while other deities welcomed closer relationships with mortal followers. The debate over proper divine-mortal distance became a recurring theme in divine councils, with no consensus emerging across the millennia. Each god established their own preferences, creating diverse religious traditions that reflected different answers to questions about divine accessibility and mortal dignity. The elemental planes remained the most obvious physical legacy of the Dawn War, their very existence representing the compromise between divine order and primordial chaos that the war's outcome had established. Elemental beings who inhabited these planes lived according to their natures, while operating within constraints divine law imposed. Fire elementals burned but could not ignite the entire cosmos. Water elementals flowed but could not drown all existence. Earth elementals shaped stone but could not unmake the foundations of reality. Air elementals whirled but could not scatter the material plane into component atoms. These limitations, invisible but absolute, ensured that elemental expression remained bounded within acceptable parameters. The legacy of the Dawn War manifested in countless small ways throughout mortal existence. Every earthquake recalled primordial Pyrrhonoth's power. Every thunderstorm echoed Bryaxis's rage. Every volcano erupting channeled Nehushta's flames. Every glacier advancing carried traces of Cryonax's cold. Mortals living through these natural disasters rarely understood they were experiencing muted echoes of conflicts that had nearly torn reality apart during its formation. The gods had succeeded in establishing a cosmos where such forces could exist without threatening fundamental stability, but they could not eliminate them entirely, without destroying the elemental diversity that made material existence possible. The continuing tension between preservation and change defined the post-war cosmos. Gods sought to maintain the order they had fought so hard to establish, while primordial essence, still woven into reality's fabric, constantly pushed against divine constraints. This tension manifested in every aspect of existence. Weather remained unpredictable despite divine oversight. Geology shifted through volcanic and tectonic forces that gods could moderate, but not eliminate. Oceans rose and fell in patterns that reflected both divine design and elemental nature. The post-war reality represented not static divine order but rather dynamic equilibrium between opposing forces, each held in check by the other, neither able to achieve absolute dominance. The Dawn War ended with divine victory, but without complete divine triumph. Gods won the right to shape reality according to their vision, but they could not erase primordial nature from existence without destroying the very fabric they sought to preserve. They defeated the primordials, but could not eliminate elemental force without undoing their own creation. They established cosmic order, but had to accept that their order would always contain chaotic elements that resisted complete control. This ambiguous outcome, neither absolute victory nor mere ceasefire, defined the cosmos that emerged from the conflict. The gods ruled but did not reign unopposed. Order prevailed but did not eliminate. Chaos. Creation triumphed, but destruction remained an ever-present possibility. The ages that followed the Dawn War saw the gradual implementation of systems and structures the gods had merely sketched during the conflict's immediate aftermath. Portfolio boundaries became more precisely defined as gods discovered the consequences of overlapping authorities. Divine hierarchies formalized, with greater gods assuming leadership roles, while lesser deities accepted subordinate positions. Celestial bureaucracies emerged to manage the increasingly complex interactions between divine will and mortal reality. Angels specialized into different orders, each focused on specific aspects of divine service. These developments occurred gradually over millennia, but they all trace their origins to needs the gods had first recognized during the war against the primordials. The gods' relationship with fate and prophecy became complicated by the Dawn War's outcome. Prior to the conflict, the future had remained genuinely undetermined, awaiting whatever shape gods or primordials might impose upon it. After the war, divine victory established certain cosmic certainties that constrained even divine action. Gods discovered they could not arbitrarily alter fundamental aspects of reality they had established. The laws they had created to govern the cosmos governed gods as well as mortals. This limitation became a source of divine frustration and mortal hope, suggesting that even gods remain bound by principles beyond their control. That fate contained elements neither mortal nor divine agency could change. The memory of the Dawn War remained strongest among dragons, who carried within their racial consciousness knowledge passed down from Io. Dragon historians maintained extensive records of the conflict, though different draconic subspecies interpreted those records according to their own alignments and agendas. Metallic dragons emphasized the necessity of divine victory and the importance of maintaining cosmic order. Chromatic dragons focused on the glory of conflict itself and the power Io had wielded before his division. Gem dragons meditated on the war's philosophical implications, questioning whether divine victory had truly served the cosmos's best interests or had merely replaced one form of tyranny with another. These draconic perspectives ensured that the Dawn War remained a living historical subject rather than fossilized ancient myth. The current state of the D&D multiverse reflects the Dawn War's outcome in every detail of its structure and function. The planes maintain their relative positions because gods arranged them that way. Magic operates according to principles gods established. Mortal races inhabit worlds gods created or shaped. Divine power flows through channels the Dawn War's necessities defined. Elemental forces express themselves within bounds divine victory imposed. The abyss threatens but cannot consume reality because gods learned to contain it. Tharizdun remains imprisoned because gods discovered the dangers of allowing even one of their number to operate outside cosmic law. Everything mortals encounter in their adventures, every dungeon delved and dragon fought and deity worshipped, exists within the framework that ancient conflict between gods and primordials constructed.